place. Look at verse 15 with me. Assyria is our culprit at the moment. I'll ask you that again here in a moment, I'd say, as we move forward through the text. But in Isaiah 10:15, he says, "Shall the axe, speaking of Assyria, boast itself against him that hews therewith?" Assyria is God's tool. Assyria is the axe, or it goes on and says, "Or shall the saw," speaking metaphorically of Assyria, "magnify itself against him that shaketh it?" Or what about the rod, the staff? These are instruments. They're tools. That's what Assyria is to God. God is using Assyria as an instrument whereby He enacts judgment upon the wicked nation of Israel. So in verse 16, "Therefore shall the Lord of hosts, send among His fat ones leanness, and under His glory He shall kindle a burning like the burning of a fire, and the light of Israel shall be for a fire, and His Holy One for a flame." And now, what God is saying is Assyria has been the tool that's been doing the judging, but now God's going to dispose of them as well because they're wicked. Assyria wasn't a godly nation. And so now God's going to come back after the Assyrian thing, and He's going to stand up for His people. And He's going to attack Assyria. Who's going to do it? We don't necessarily need to pick out a historical reference. Maybe we should say Babylon in 612, the battle of Assyria ultimately was destroyed. But I don't think that's the point at all. God's just simply saying, the tool that I've been using will be disposed of. Take a look at verse 18. "And shall consume the glory of his forest and of the fruitful field, both soul and body, and they shall be when a standard-bearer fainteth. And the rest of the trees of his forest," speaking of Assyria, "shall be few." Probably having a cryptic reference to the idea where the death angel came out in the middle of the night and slew the 185,000 of the Assyrians with King Sennacherib. Of course, King Sennacherib lived beyond that, went back to Assyria, but the army was smitten and only a few trees in the forest were left, it says in verse 19. Okay, any comments, any questions up through that section? Okay, take a look at 20. "It shall come to pass in that day." I don't hold this point back. You see that phrase, "in that day." Some, like Wayne Jackson, say that it inherently refers to a messianic time frame. Well, that's nonsense in light of the context. The context is telling us this has to do with the Assyrian affair. So it's not anything to do about Christ necessarily. The prophet sometimes had a message in the 7th century for a 7th century audience about 7th century events. And that's what's going on in Isaiah 10. Isaiah 5 used the phrase the same way in Isaiah 5, 30 and 31. Obadiah uses the phrase. In Obadiah, he's only got one chapter. But in Obadiah 1, he uses the phrase verses 8, 15, and then 17 through 21, and he's talking about the fall of Edom. So the phrase "in that day" is not inherently messianic. It speaks about the day in the context. What day is he talking about? The day when Assyria is smitten. Okay, so he says in verse 20, "It shall come to pass in that day when Assyria is judged, and God stands up for Israel, that the faithful remnant of Israel, and such as are escaped of the house of Jacob, shall no more again stay upon him that smote them." And the word "stay" there means to lean upon or to rest upon. It's not going to be the case anymore that Israel and the house of Jacob will rest upon him that smote them, speaking of the Assyrian. Instead, who do they put their trust in? Look at the rest of the text. "But they shall rest," or stay, "they shall trust upon the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth." So he's saying instead of trusting Assyria, a human leader, they're going to finally put their trust in God and trust His divine plan to carry them through. Well, in verse 21 it says, "The remnant shall return." This is interesting. We do not see the names Shear-Jashub or Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz described for us in Isaiah's text. But what Isaiah does use is a word play. And if you were looking at the original syntax, he uses the words Sha'ar-Yashub, which is Shear-Jashub. The name literally means, and it's translated here for us in 10:21, "the remnant shall return." He's making a word play. So whenever Isaiah showed up with his child Shear-Jashub or Shear-Yashub, the people knew His name alone means a remnant will be saved. And so by carrying His child with Him, He sends a message to the people, only a few are righteous, only a few will be saved. And of course, Paul picks up on this theme and insists that the same kind of remnant that existed back here in Isaiah's day, the righteous people, is the same group that exists in Paul's own day, the faithful. And that's what he gets at. That's what Paul gets at in Romans 9 through 11. So in Isaiah, look at this in verse 21. The remnant shall return, even the remnant of Jacob, unto the mighty God. Who are they trusting in here? Seems straightforward, doesn't it? They're trusting in God. Look at 9:6 again. Go back a page and look at 9:6. And whoever's got 9:6, read that for us if you don't mind.
For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Okay.
We've touched on this, so I won't belabor the point. But in 9:6, the common view among the scholars, if you read any of the scholars, you pull their books off the shelves, they're going to tell you that this actually refers to Hezekiah. But if we look at that and how the title's used, and I've given argumentation on why we should reject Hezekiah as being the child that's born here. But if you take a look at 10:21 again, he uses the same title, but to whom does he refer it? He refers it to God. So he's not talking about Hezekiah, but what he's actually doing is he's actually saying it's not Hezekiah because the people can't trust in a human ruler. They've got to trust in a divine figure. It's got to be God. And so when he talks about this child that's born in 9, 6, and 7, he's talking about a divine heir to the throne. Now, some of that may have been misunderstood by the Jews in the 5th century, 6th century BC. They may not have gotten all of that. And I think it's rightfully argued that the Jews probably thought at first it may have been Hezekiah. They may have even then thought that it was Josiah. Or maybe they even thought that the child, this Messiah, was to be identified in Zerubbabel. But every time they saw a king like that arise, they saw Hezekiah rise up, and then they saw, well, he's sinning. He's not doing it right. The nation's no better off than it was before. They start to conclude, well, no, Hezekiah's not it. Maybe they had thought that Josiah, this goodly, godly king, was to be their Messiah. And they watched him do great things for the nation. And then they got to looking at him, and all of a sudden one day in the battle with Pharaoh Necho, he died. He was slain. And they brought his body back into the city, and there was great mourning, the text says in 2 Chronicles. Then they thought, well, maybe he's not the Messiah either. And then, of course, Zerubbabel was a major disappointment. Oh, he built a temple, but it wasn't greater than Solomon's. Prophets told him about one greater than Solomon's. Only part of the people came back. Not all of them returned to the land. The prophets spake about them all coming back. So Zerubbabel was a disappointment as well. When we look at 10 and verse 21, their trust could not have been in a mere political figure like Hezekiah, Zerubbabel, Josiah, or any other figure like that. It had to be in the mighty God, a divine figure who would stand up and execute judgment and justice for the people. And so in 10:22, it says, for though thy people Israel be as the sand of the sea, yet only a remnant of them shall return. Not all of them are going to be faithful. Not all of them are going to be the selected ones. And there's a reason for that. He's not merely doing this just randomly. It's based on faithfulness. And it says, the consumption decreed shall overflow with righteousness. And then in verse 23 it says, the Lord God of hosts shall make a consumption, even determined in the midst of all the land. Okay, let me paraphrase. What the text is talking about, and Paul uses the section in Romans 9. God is saying only a group of Israel is the remnant. You've got two groups of Israel. And Paul draws this out for us in the book of Romans. We looked at that a couple quarters ago. You've got Israel here. And these are all physical Israelites. Every single one of them. But then you've got this other group here. And they wear the name Israel. This part here, that's physical Israel. Those are Jews who are faithful. Paul says those are the 7,000 that had not bowed their knee to Baal. Romans 11, verse 3. He's referencing 1 Kings 17 through 19. The part over here, this is a Gentile body. They're physically Gentiles. But what this whole group here is remnant. And what Isaiah is insisting on is only a select group out of physical Israel are actually faithful to God. Oh, we're Abraham's seed. Who cares? Who cares? You're committing fornication, you're worshiping idols, you're getting drunk. These are the points that Isaiah is bringing out. Just because you're a physical Jew means nothing to God. You've got to be a faithful physical Jew in order to be the Israel of which Paul, Isaiah, the other prophets, they speak of. So he goes on in Isaiah chapter 10, and he says in verse 24, "Therefore, thus saith the Lord God of hosts, O my people that dwell in Zion," Jerusalem, "be not afraid of the Assyrian. He shall smite thee with a rod." That's an interesting phrase. I'll come back to that here in just a moment. And he says, "And shall lift up his staff against thee after the manner of Egypt." Take a look at Micah 5 with me. Turn over to Micah 5. And remember that phrase, "He shall smite thee with a rod." Look at Micah 5. The same kind of syntax is used here. Micah chapter 5 and verse 1. Whoever's got Micah 5:1, go ahead and read that for us if you don't mind.
"Now gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops, be up, lay siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek."
Here's the smiting of the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek. It's tough to tell who it is that's being smitten here. It's obviously an Israeli king. Maybe Jehoiakim, maybe Zedekiah. But what Micah says is the king of Israel is going to be smitten with the rod upon the cheek. Same kind of thing that Isaiah is talking about. Not the same entity, not the same identification, same kind of thing. Go back to Isaiah chapter 10. Israel's ruler is going to be smitten with a rod by Assyria, and shall lift up his staff against thee. Assyria is going to lift up his staff against Israel after the manner of Egypt. And then it says, keep that thing about the rod and the staff, that kind of thing, and the smiting upon the cheek. Keep that in mind. It'll resurface in 11. In Isaiah 11:4, you'll see that same kind of thing said again. But in 10:25, "Yet a little while, a very little while, and the indignation shall cease, and mine anger in their destruction." Judgment is coming. It's imminent. It's at the door. And then it says in 26, "The Lord of hosts shall stir up a scourge for him according to the slaughter of Midian at the rock of Oreb. And as his rod was upon the sea, so shall he lift it up after the manner of Egypt." I'm going to skip through some of this for sake of time and interpretive reasons. And 27, "It shall come to pass in that day that his burden shall be taken away from off thy shoulder," speaking of the Assyrian burden. Assyria will be destroyed, and it says, "And his yoke will be taken off from thy neck." The yoke shall be destroyed because of the anointing, because of the Messiah, meaning the anointed king, whomever it may have been at the time. And it says in 28, "And he shall come to Iath." He's passed to Migron. We're just reading a bunch of geographical locations. Read them with me for a moment. "At Michmash he hath laid up his carriages. They are gone over the passage. They've taken up their lodging at Geba. Ramah is afraid. Gibeah of Saul is fled. Lift up your voice, O daughter of Gallim. It shall be heard unto Laish, O poor Anathoth." Bunch of names. 33. "Behold, the Lord of hosts, shall lop the bow with terror." Okay, let me give you a map just so you know where we are. The Mediterranean Sea was off to the west. And then you had, of course, the Sea of Galilee, and you had the Red Sea. All of these cities that we just to are scattered throughout. And what it describes is an invasion of Assyria from that direction. The Annals of Sennacherib describe another invasion from this way. It would seem, given the biblical record and then also the archaeological finds, there's one archaeological find that insists that there were two invasions of Sennacherib, two different directions. It seems, given the data, that that's the best way to go. So what Assyria is doing is he's coming down by the leadership of some of these guys like Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, and the others. They come down from also the north, but then they also move from the east. And the invasion takes place. They're situated in the land of Palestine. Sennacherib's whole campaign ends with his surrounding of the city of Zion, Jerusalem. He makes the boast that he has Hezekiah shut up like a bird in a cage. His armies are all around the city. There's no escape. And in 2 Kings 18, 2 Kings 19, we see King Hezekiah put on the sackcloth and the ashes. He hits his knees in prayer. And in the middle of the night, the death angel comes out and slays the Assyrian army, and they go back home. The very event tells us it wasn't Hezekiah who saved the people. It was God who saved the people. So in Isaiah chapter 10, look at what happens in 33 and 34. The Lord of hosts, shall lop the bow with terror, and the high ones of stature shall be hewn down, and the haughty shall be humbled. He's talking about judgment upon Israel. Israel is going to be humbled, and he shall cut down the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon shall fall by a mighty one. Remember, from 10:15, Assyria is the axe. In the vision, Isaiah has just seen Assyria, as it were, acting as the part of the axe, chopping down the trees of Israel. And all of this looks very dark. All of this looks very dismal. And then we open up to 11:1, where the prophet says, but don't think that this is the end of the nation. Don't think we're lost here. Instead, he opens up with 11:1 and says, but there will come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse. Just when it looks like all hope is lost, God now, from this stump, brings up a sprout, a root. And it's one of Jesse's descendants. It's the Davidic heir. Who is he speaking of in 11:1? Well, of course, it's messianic. But how do we think Isaiah understood this section? If we look at a timeline, the prophet is not, this is going to be complex, and I tried to cover this as best as I could in my introduction. But let's imagine for the moment that the year is 701 BC. That's when it was that Sennacherib surrounded the city and made an invasion upon Jerusalem. If the oracle of Isaiah comes at this point, remember, he's preaching about deliverance from the Assyrian threat. When he starts talking about this Messiah, this Davidic heir, who is he talking about? From a Jewish perspective, put yourself in the shoes of a Jew, maybe 5th century BC, 6th century BC. I'm sure this is the case. Messiah, a word literally meaning the anointed, did not equal Jesus. Now, work with me for just a moment. They didn't know who Jesus was. Jesus was a Hebrew name. It meant it's the same name as Joshua. And that's the same name you see in Hebrews chapter 4. If you had asked any Jew, who is the Messiah? You could have asked Isaiah this question. You know what he would have said? I don't know. I don't know who it is. They're still looking for the identification. Who is the Messiah? They don't know. So in Isaiah's viewpoint, he could have been thinking it's probably Hezekiah. And then he finds out, no, that's a disappointment. He may have thought Josiah. Then he found out, no, that was another disappointment. He may have thought Zerubbabel. We'll call him Z. That's kind of how Doris does it. We'll just call him Z. Isn't that right, B? Isaiah doesn't know where to find the Messiah. But what he's not doing is abandoning the deliverance or the redemption that he's preaching. It was always fitting to a nation that's undergoing a threat or an oppression to preach of all of those prophetic ideals. Remember, we brought up that song, and the songwriter, Walter Kent, talks about there's coming a day, tomorrow, the writer says. And he's writing during World War II. And he says, there's a day coming tomorrow where the shepherd will tend to his sheep. Jimmy's going to sleep in his room again. The bombs are not going to fall anymore from the sky. And we can start picking at that song. We can start saying, well, I wonder what he's talking about. Probably Hitler's suicide. Probably not. He's not that predictive. He's a mere human. He's writing the song in 1941. Well, maybe he's talking about the Nuremberg trials, 45, 46, 1945, 1946. Once again, probably not. He's not miraculously endowed. What he's doing is he's painting an ideal scene. To whom? To the oppressed, to the exiles, to those who are being beaten by Hitler. Isaiah, it seems to me, does the exact same thing. Here's the crisis, 701. And how's he supposed to preach to these Jews that are undergoing this kind of threat? Well, he's probably going to tell them about a Messiah. Probably going to tell them about a united land. Maybe a new kingdom. Well, one of these things where the temple is built upon the mountain of Jerusalem and it just shines forth. And even all the Gentiles out there scattered around, they even want to come into the city. That sounds good, doesn't it? He's not predicting with isolated proof texts, these little snippets that are supposed to be grabbed by the New Testament writers. He's preaching a theme. The theme is redemption, and it doesn't get better than this. So he says in 11:1, there shall come out of Jesse a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. Isaiah doesn't know where to find this. Guess what? We are more fortunate than he was. We have the New Testament. And the New Testament tells us when that expected Messiah that all the Jews looked for, he finally came. Who did he come through? Jesus Christ. Do you see how one is more conceptual, but Jesus Christ is specific? Talking about a Messiah to Isaiah was very open. What Isaiah left open, who's the Messiah? The New Testament closed and said it's Jesus Christ. So he's not abandoning by preaching the Messiah. He's not abandoning the threat in 701. He's preaching to the Jews about a deliverance, an ideal deliverance that was always fitting to speak to them about. So take a look at this. In Isaiah 11:1, he tells us that the branch shall grow out of his roots. We've seen the word branch a couple of times in Isaiah already. We saw it in 4:2. There's Siri. We saw the word branch in 4:2. We see the kind of thing in 6:13. We see it in 27, I think. We see it in Zechariah's text. We see it in Jeremiah. The word we've been seeing for branch has been samak. We haven't seen this word in 11:1 yet. This word is netzer. It seems to me this is grabbed by Matthew 2:23. Take a look at that. Somebody grab Matthew 2:23 for us. Whoever's got it, go ahead.
And he came and dwelt in the city called Nazareth, and its sight be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. He shall be called a Nazarene.
Does anybody have a cross reference on that to a passage in the Old Testament? 11:1. Any others? Which one? Judges 13:5. Okay, that's a non-messianic context. It seems to me the only possibility is a reference back to Isaiah 11:1. What he's doing is he's saying the prophets, all of them, spake about this individual that's to come out of Nazareth. We don't need to look for a direct quotation where he says, he shall come out of Nazareth. It seems to me that Isaiah, though, talking about the messianic figure, says, he shall be called the netzer, the branch. And it seems to me that Matthew makes a play on the word and says even Isaiah spake about him being called the Nazarene. Does that make sense? He's making an echo back to Isaiah 11:1, Matthew is, and saying the prophets looked at the Messiah as coming forth. Yes?
Is that because netzer is somehow connected to Nazarene?
No, I think he's using wordplay. Yeah.
You know, Drew, it never was meant to be specific in the Old Testament because actually laid it out. But in the New Testament, it still is a mystery, a mystery, a mystery. Everything was a mystery. They were looking forward to the Christ, the Messiah. They didn't know when he was going to come. They didn't know what to expect. They just knew he was coming.
Yeah.
And you could see the prophet, you could build somebody's hope and not know when it's going to take place. You say, it's going to happen. You're going to win. It's
Yeah.
going to happen. And you build a hope, and give them some hope.
Yeah.
And I can see that happening here because you can see these, speaking of the Messiah, the deliverer, and all these characteristics speaking about the Messiah and Jesus.
Yes.
And it was a mystery to these people. They
Yeah.
didn't know until the New Testament revealed who all these people were talking about.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, here's your 3 sections. If you like writing in your Bible, this might be a good division to write in just to break the chapter down. In verses 1 through 5, you've got the ideal ruler. And that's what we're getting ready to look at, the remaining 4 verses. You've got the ideal ruler in verses 1 through 5. In verses 6 through 10, you've got the ideal kingdom. But then in verses 11 through 16, the remaining verses of the chapter, you've got the ideal deliverance. Verses 1 through 5, you've got the ideal ruler. Verses 6 through 10 breaks down nicely about the ideal kingdom. And then verses 11 through 16 are the ideal redemption or the ideal deliverance. Here's the point. And I hope I'm not repeating myself way too much. But back here in 701, the only way they know how to preach to the Jews about a good time coming, about hope, is to preach of all those ideals, which included the kingdom, the ruler, deliverance, and that sort of thing. Other prophets, like Ezekiel, will tell us about a united kingdom where they're both joined back together. Or Isaiah himself will tell us in chapter 13, he's going to tell us that they're going to go back to the land. All of these things find themselves in this idealistic time of hope. And so in 701 BC, Isaiah and all the other prophets just preached that way. Okay, look at 11:2 then. The Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, speaking of the Messiah. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Interestingly enough, you count that up, that's 7. 7 quote-unquote spirits. It's not a coincidence this text is grabbed in the book of Revelation and insisted about the Christ once more. In Isaiah 11:2, he lists 7 spirits that rest upon the figure. The same is done in Revelation 5 about the lamb, the lion lamb out of Judah. Same guy, same figure. Here's the spirits of the Lord, all 7 of them, the complete Spirit of the Lord resting upon him. Okay, in verse 3, and shall make him of quick understanding in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears. That's an allusion back to Solomon. Remember how Solomon proved his wisdom? Somebody remind us of that story if you can.
That's what he asked for.
He asked for it. That's right. The Lord came to him in a dream, said, hey, what?
The 2 women came to him.
Yes.
And one was claiming it was her baby, the other was claiming
Yes. Yes. They got the 2 babies.
One baby, 2 mothers.
That's it. 2 babies, one dies.
Yeah.
And there's 1 baby left over. And the one says, oh, that's my child. And the other says, no, it's not. And so Solomon comes up with the idea, we'll split them in 2. We'll split the baby in 2. And then the real mother says, she can have it. Let's let the child live. And he says, aha, we know who the real mama is. This is a reference back to that kind of thing. The Messiah, one of David's descendants, that's what Christ is. He's going to come and he's going to be even like Solomon. He's going to be that wise. And that's what 11:3 says. Look at 4. But with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth, and he shall smite the earth with the rod. Oh, you think Assyria got one up on God's people by smiting them with a rod? God's going to send them a leader, a king who will do Assyria justice. And this king is going to come forth with a rod as well. Psalm 2:9 is a good reference there, where it talks about the king going to rule with an iron rod. And then it says, and make no mistake about it, the New Testament uses that psalm messianically. In 11:5, and righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins. He's going to have a belt, probably from J.C. Penney, and it's going to wear the title righteousness. And then it's going to say faithfulness will be the girdle of his reins. Here's a ruler you can't buy. That's what he's getting at. You've been wanting deliverance. It's going to come in this Davidic heir. And of course, Jesus Christ fulfills all those hopes, though there's a rearrangement of what they expected that to be. Okay, we get into this section 11:6. Yes.
What did you say that
Psalm
psalm was?
2:9. Psalm 2:9. Okay, so in 11:6, somebody, if you would, remind us here in just a moment. I'm going to read through verse 9. And then I want you to think back. We're going to think back before Isaiah's day. What might Isaiah try to bring to the minds of the Jews? What does this scene sound like? In 11:6, it says, the wolf will dwell with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the kid. And the calf and the young lion and the fatling together. They'll all be together. And a little child will even be there in the midst and will lead these animals. And then it says in verse 7, the cow and the bear will feed, presumably together. Their young ones shall lie down together. The lion will eat straw like the ox. The sucking child, the infant, the baby, will play on the hole of this snake, the asp. And the weaned child, the one that's just about 2 or 3 years old, who's been weaned off of baby food, shall put his hand on the cockatrice den, or the snake's den, the adder's den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Does this evoke any kind of Old Testament scene or memory? Yes.
You think it's referring to the Garden of Eden?
I think it's referring to the Garden of Eden. How else do you describe peace? Even if you look back to David or Solomon and you preach of peace, they still had enemies. There was still fighting going on. What David is doing, or what Isaiah is doing, is he's trying to get us to think all the way back to the garden when the animals and the human beings were at peace with one another. They were all vegetarians. And what he's doing is he's saying, when the Messiah comes, don't take all of this literally. Definitely don't take all of this literally. He's saying the Messiah is going to be the ideal peace bringer. He's not talking about anything specific. He's just saying that the king's coming and he's going to bring peace. So, that's what he's getting at in Isaiah 11, 6 through 9. He says in verse 10, in all my holy mountain, speaking of Jerusalem, Zion, the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord. Ideally. Once again, we'd be foolish to think all of this is literal and to say that there's a day coming like the premillennialists suggest where God's going to place His feet on this earth and He's going to reign for 1,000 years and there's not going to be a single enemy, that sort of thing. That's not really biblical. It's very, very, very sparse, even when you get to talking to them from the text. But in Isaiah 11:9, what he's doing is he's describing conceptually what would be an ideal time. So in verse 10, in that day, which day is it? The day in the context. When the Messiah arrives, there will be a root of Jesse which shall stand for an ensign of the people, or a flag of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. So, we've got our ideal time here. And let's say one said, oh, I know when this is going to be fulfilled. It's in Hezekiah. No. Hezekiah was a disappointment. Josiah. No. Zerubbabel. No. And then an inspired apostle comes, and he grabs a hold of this text, and he says, here it is. Look at Romans 15, verse 12. Look at what Paul does with the passage. When Isaiah leaves this messianic text open, the people don't really know where to posit its fulfillment. And then Paul comes along and says, remember that prophecy that's still open? Nobody's closed it yet. It's not been fulfilled. Remember how you're still looking for a Messiah, a Davidic heir who's going to stand up and execute judgment and justice and redemption for the people? Look at what's stated in Romans 15:12. Whoever's got it, go ahead.
And all the multitude kept silent and gave audience to Barnabas and Paul, declaring what miracles and wonders.
Did I say Acts? Okay. You must be in Acts.
I am.
Okay, if you'll grab Romans for us. Romans 15:12, yes.
And again, Isaiah said, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he shall rise to reign over the Gentiles, and him shall the Gentiles trust.
Oh, he's quoting 11:10 of Isaiah. Isaiah said this. What's he doing? He's closing the prophecy, quote unquote. He's saying, remember that you've been looking for this kind of guy? He's come. He's here. Jump back to Isaiah 11. So, while you're turning there, if Paul makes use of the passage, says that it was fulfilled in Christ in the first century, Jew and Gentile come together in one body. This ideal time, this ideal kingdom that's been preached about by Isaiah is not something we should still look for in our future. The premillennialists make heavy usage of this section in order to insist that there's a day coming where the lion and the lamb will all lie down together and it's just going to be a giddy time. That's not really what the prophet's going for. Okay, take a look at 11:11. It will come to pass in that day, same context, same day in the context, that the Lord shall set His hand again the second time to recover the remnant of His people. Okay, let me test our hands once more on this idea about preaching about the deliverance. How would you explain email to somebody living in the 1800s? You see what I'm saying? It's going to be difficult, isn't it?
Cartoons say go look in the mailbox.
That's it.
Got mail.
That's it. There's going to be a difficulty, isn't there? You might say, well, computer. What's a computer? Well, you're going to use one and it's going to have the internet. What's the internet? You've got a real difficulty of explaining this idea. So you might talk to somebody in the 1800s about email. Well, it's going to be a really quick postal guy. That's it. Pony Express is going to be sped up quite a bit. That's probably the best you can do, How does Isaiah preach to the Jews about this messianic time? He's going to tell them, you're going back home. You're getting a new king. Look at 11:11 again, where he says he's going to set his hand again the second time. This raises the question of when was the first? Probably back in Egypt. On a timeline, it's probably around the year 1445 BC, when the Jews come out of Egypt. And so, this is the first deliverance, the first highway to the land of Israel. The second time, in the context, he's talking about a return from Babylon. Historically, literally, that's fulfilled in the year 536-ish, maybe 539-ish, through Cyrus, when they come out of Babylon and also Assyria. And that is what Isaiah is talking about. He's talking about going back home. There's going to be a highway back to your land. But he's not talking necessarily literally or historically. So don't be shocked that if there are elements of the context of the prophecy that are fulfilled here in the Second Temple era, but there are also elements that we don't see until the time of the Messiah. Well, you might say, well, does that mean it's partially fulfilled here and then completely fulfilled here? I don't think that's what the prophet's going for. Isaiah has them all fused into this ideal time. It's all one in his mind. There's coming one ideal redemption, one ideal deliverance. It's going to come through the Messiah. We're going to be back home. We're going to have a temple. Our mountain's going to be shining forth. The Gentiles are going to see it. Everything's going to be set right. And that's how he looks at it. When he talks about the second time, this is just part of the hope oracle. He's just preaching of a day when they're delivered. And he doesn't know to divide it into two different points. That's what God has going on behind the context. So take a look at this in 11. He's going to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, Egypt, Petros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath. Shinar is Babylon, by the way. And from the islands of the sea, wherever the people are, if they're not home in Jerusalem, we're going to bring them back. He's speaking idealistically. And then he says in verse 12, he'll set up a flag for the nations. He'll assemble the outcasts of Israel. He'll gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And remember how even when David was king, Israel and Judah were at each other's throats? That's what the book of 2 Samuel teaches us. They were butting heads way back when, even in David and Solomon's reigns. Look at this in verse 13. The envy of Ephraim, northern Israel, is going to vanish. It's going to depart. And then it says in 13, and the adversaries of Judah will be cut off. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah. Judah will not vex Ephraim. They're going to be living in harmony again. Here's a united kingdom once more. Doesn't that sound good? Never literally happens. Nor should we expect it to. The prophet is merely preaching in the only kind of language he knows how to about a deliverance that's coming. And so he says in verse 14, but they will fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines toward the west. They'll spoil them of the east together. They'll lay their hand upon Edom and Moab. All of the foreigners are going to submit to Israel. And it says, and the children of Ammon shall obey them. Verse 15, the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea. Why would he bring up the Exodus again? Why would he talk about them smiting the Red Sea that they had already opened up and walked through on the dry ground? Why would he bring that up? What he's doing is he's saying this is going to happen again. When he says Egypt, this is complex. Get this point. When he says Egypt, he reminisces on Egypt. He means Assyria. Let me prove that to you. Jump over to Hosea. Jump to Hosea 7. And it's verse, I think, 16. Hosea 7:16. Hosea is one of those contemporaries. He prophesies, he preaches at the same time as Isaiah. Whoever's got Hosea 7:16, go ahead and read that for us if you don't mind.
They return but not to the Most High. They are like a treacherous soul. Their princes shall fall by the sword, for the curses of their tongue shall be their derision in the land of Egypt.
In the land of Egypt. The people never went back to Egypt literally, historically. What's he talking about? Somebody get 8:13 of Hosea, just across the page. Just get 13D, the very last phrase, last like 4 or 5 words.
They shall return to Egypt.
They shall return to Egypt. This never happens. So what's the prophet mean? Look at 9:3. In Hosea 9:3, he clears it up for us. And the Jews knew then what he meant. He's reminiscing on Egypt, where they spent 430 years in bondage. And now somebody read 9:3 for us.
They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but people shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean things in Syria.
Oh, now we get it. When he says Egypt, he's flooding their minds with rich history. Oh, we're going back to bondage. We're going into captivity. There's going to be a Pharaoh that's going to oppress us. And of course, he's speaking about the Assyrian king. But jump back to Isaiah then. Why does he bring up the Red Sea? Same reason he brought it up in Hosea's text. The Lord will destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea. He's going to make a highway for you out of captivity. You're going to be freed. You're going to be liberated. And he says in verse 15, and with his mighty wind shall he shake his hand over the river. Is he talking about the Nile? Or is he talking about the Euphrates? Probably the Euphrates, which is the Assyrian water point. And then it says, and shall smite it in the 7 streams and make men go over dry shod. In verse 16, here it is. He comes out with it explicitly. There shall be a highway, a trail, a path. God's going to make it clear. For the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria. You're going home. Like as it was to Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. And that's the point that he makes. Okay, we're going to run through 12, 1 through 6 very quickly. 12 is part of 11, so it flows nicely. In that same day, 12:1, they're going to say, oh Lord, I'll praise you. You were angry with me, but your anger is turned away. You now actually are our comforter. Here's the God of hope standing up for the people. Behold, God is my salvation, not Hezekiah. I will trust. I won't be afraid. That's what the prophet told them in 10:25. The Lord Jehovah is my strength and my song. They're singing a song of victory, quite like Moses and the people did in Exodus 15 after they crossed over the sea. Here's the song of Moses and the Lamb, song of redemption. And then it says in verse 3, therefore with joy you'll draw water out of the wells of salvation. In that same day when the Messiah comes, when victory comes, when redemption comes, you'll say, praise the Lord, call upon His name, declare His doings among the people, make mention that His name, not ours, His name is exalted. Sing unto the Lord, He has done these excellent things. Not Hezekiah, not a mere man, not us, the people. God has worked this redemption. And then in 6, cry out and shout, inhabitants of Zion. We finally realized who's great. It's not us. It's the Holy One in Israel. And that's the point that Isaiah is getting through. Any closing comments or questions? Okay, we'll pick up in 13 next week. Totally different section. We'll pick up in 13 next week.